There are battles that changed borders. There are battles that destroyed kingdoms. And then there are battles that divided history itself into before and after. The spring of 1453 belongs to that second category. By the time the smoke had cleared above Constantinople, an empire more than 1,000 years old had disappeared forever. Ancient Rome, in its final surviving form, had finally reached the edge of time. And what makes this story remarkable is not only the collapse of an empire, it is the scale of the imbalance. Roughly 7,000 defenders against a force that contemporary accounts often push toward 100,000 men. Numbers in medieval history are always difficult. Chroniclers loved exaggeration as much as they loved victory. But even if we strip away the legends and cut the estimates down to reality, one fact remains impossible to ignore. The defenders were outnumbered on a terrifying scale. And this is the detail that always strikes with particular force. Cities usually surrender when mathematics becomes hopeless. Men understand numbers. Men understand survival. But Constantinople had stopped living by ordinary rules long before 1453. The city had become something else, a symbol, a memory, a fortress carrying the weight of 1,000 years. As the final days approached, Europe watched with indifference that feels almost painful to examine centuries later. Messages traveled west. Appeals were written. Desperate requests crossed mountains and seas. Assistance was promised. Assistance was discussed. Assistance was delayed. And while politicians argued, Sultan Mehmed II was preparing for history. He was only 21 years old? 21. That fact alone still carries an almost unsettling energy. At an age when many princes were still proving themselves in tournaments and court intrigues, Mehmed had already fixed his eyes upon the greatest prize of the age. Constantinople was not simply another city on a map. It was the city, the queen of cities, the gateway between continents, the crown that every conqueror had imagined wearing. And there was something personal in Mehmed's determination. One can almost feel it in the surviving accounts. Some rulers seek wealth, some seek security, others seek immortality. Mehmed wanted history itself, because for centuries armies had broken themselves against these walls. Persians failed, Arabs failed, Bulgars failed, Russians failed. Hayyas, crusaders, had occupied the city once through betrayal, but they had not conquered it through strength. Again and again the walls stood. Again and again Constantinople survived. And there is something almost intimidating about the city's confidence by this point. Even after centuries of decline, even after territory had vanished and armies had shrunk, people still looked at those walls and believed they were looking at eternity. The Theodosian Walls stretched across the land approaches of the city like a stone declaration of defiance. Massive outer defenses, deep ditches, secondary barriers, and then enormous primary walls rising behind them, layer after layer, defense built upon defense. These walls had stared down empires. Even today, standing beside the surviving sections, there is a strange feeling that appears almost immediately. The scale feels wrong. Photographs never communicate it properly. Distances become distorted. Human figures become tiny. Stone becomes landscape. And suddenly, an uncomfortable question appears. How does anyone attack this? Mehmed believed he had an answer: gunpowder. Not merely cannons, massive cannons. A Hungarian engineer named Urban had arrived offering his services. Ironically, he had first approached Constantinople itself. The Byzantines could not afford his price. The empire that once ruled the Mediterranean could barely pay for its own survival. That detail carries a bitter taste. History sometimes turns on enormous ideas and legendary heroes. Sometimes it turns because someone could not pay a bill. Mehmed welcomed Urban immediately. Soon workshops roared with activity. Furnace fires illuminated the darkness. Bronze flowed like rivers of liquid sunlight. Workers hammered day and night. The result was something extraordinary. Enormous siege cannons unlike anything the world had previously seen. The largest among them became almost mythical in later descriptions. Thousands of kilograms of metal, massive stone projectiles, Teams of men and animals required simply to move the weapon. Modern audiences sometimes imagine medieval warfare as endless swords and cavalry charges, but here the future was arriving with thunder, and Constantinople was about to hear it. By early April, the Ottoman army appeared before the city. The horizon changed first. Dust rose in distant waves, banners emerged, columns stretched across the landscape, infantry, cavalry, engineers, siege specialists, camp followers, supply wagons. An entire moving world had arrived. Inside Constantinople, church bells rang. Citizens moved through narrow streets carrying supplies and weapons. Priests walked among crowds offering prayers. Families looked toward the walls. Emperor Constantine XI organized the defense with astonishing calm. There is something deeply human in his position that never loses its impact. He knew the numbers. He understood the reality. He was not a fool blinded by optimism. He simply chose not to leave. Some advised escape. He refused. Some suggested negotiation. He refused, because if Constantinople was going to die, then its emperor would die with it. There are moments where history stops feeling distant. This is one of them. The defenders included Byzantines, Genoese soldiers under Giovanni Giustiniani, Venetian volunteers, local citizens, sailors, monks and men who only weeks earlier had never expected to become soldiers. 7,000 men. 7,000 facing a storm approaching the walls. And then the bombardment began. The sound must have been horrifying, not loud in the ordinary sense, not like thunder, not like modern artillery. Something slower, something heavier, a deep, violent force shaking air itself. The great cannons fired and stone projectiles crashed toward the ancient walls. For centuries, these defenses had resisted ladders, towers, and siege engines. But now, giant fragments of masonry exploded outward. Dust rose above Constantinople. For the first time in generations, people saw the impossible. The walls were bleeding stone. Night brought no peace. The bombardment would pause, but silence never truly returned to Constantinople. Fires burned across the Ottoman camps. Thousands of voices drifted through the darkness. Hammers struck iron. Horses moved restlessly. Commands echoed through the night air. Somewhere beyond the walls, engineers measured distances and calculated angles. Somewhere else, priests prayed beneath torchlight. Inside the city, men worked with a desperation that bordered on exhaustion. Each morning, Ottoman artillery opened breaches in the walls. Each night, the defenders repaired them. Stone was replaced with timber. Rubble became barriers. Broken sections were reinforced with earth and debris. Citizens carried rocks with bleeding hands. Monks worked beside soldiers. Merchants worked beside sailors. The city itself had become an army. And there is something deeply moving here because history often remembers emperors and generals while forgetting ordinary faces. But Constantinople survived those days because thousands of unnamed people refused to stop working. No one could sleep much. No one could escape. No one could stand aside. Every sunrise meant the walls would be tested again. Giovanni Giustiniani became one of the central figures of the defense. The experienced Genoese commander understood siege warfare better than most men alive. He moved along the walls with discipline and precision, placing troops where danger appeared greatest. Contemporary descriptions suggest that his presence alone strengthened morale. That is not difficult to understand. Armies often fight with weapons, but they survive with confidence. Men can endure astonishing things if they believe someone still knows what to do. Outside the city, Mehmed was becoming increasingly impatient. His artillery caused damage, but not enough. The walls were wounded. They were not collapsing. Days passed, then weeks, and Constantinople continued standing. For a young ruler determined to seize history, delay itself had become dangerous. Large armies consume enormous quantities of food and supplies. Time is expensive. Disease spreads. Discipline weakens. Mehmed needed momentum. He needed something unexpected. The sea appeared to offer one solution. Constantinople possessed a critical advantage, the Golden Horn. This natural harbour on the northern side of the city was protected by a gigantic defensive chain stretched across its entrance. Enemy fleets could not simply sail inside, and this chain had become one of the city's great shields. Ottoman ships approached. They tested the defenses. They failed. The chain held. For a moment, the defenders could breathe easier. For a moment, because Mehmed was not thinking like previous commanders. His mind moved toward an idea that even centuries later still feels almost unbelievable. If ships could not pass through the water, they would travel across land. The operation began secretly. Workers prepared wooden tracks. Timber pathways appeared across hills north of the city. Animal fat and oil reduced friction. Teams of men gathered ropes and equipment. Then came the movement itself. Ottoman ships were dragged over land. Warships moving where warships had absolutely no business existing. Across slopes, across earth, across hills overlooking Constantinople. The first reports arriving inside the city must have sounded absurd. Ships over land? Impossible. Ridiculous. Except it was happening. By dawn, the defenders looked toward the Golden Horn and saw Ottoman vessels behind the chain. Behind the chain. The shock was immediate. One can almost feel the emotional impact, even through surviving texts. For weeks, the defenders had lived under pressure. Now pressure became dread, because the impossible had happened. There is a reason this moment survives so vividly in military history, not because moving ships itself was impossible. Smaller examples existed before, but because of the audacity. Mehmed had effectively changed the battlefield itself. The city was now threatened from directions previously considered secure. Suddenly, men and resources had to be redistributed. Suddenly, new defenses were required. Suddenly, uncertainty entered the city. And uncertainty is dangerous. Because walls defend stone, they do not defend morale. The Ottoman attacks intensified. Siege towers moved forward. Mining operations began beneath sections of the walls. Underground warfare erupted. Ottoman engineers dug tunnels attempting to reach beneath defensive positions. Byzantine counterminers listened beneath the earth. The scene becomes almost surreal. Above-ground cannons roared and soldiers fought. Below-ground men dug through darkness carrying lamps and weapons. Then, the tunnels met. Violence exploded beneath the city itself. Steel clashed underground while earth shook overhead. Medieval warfare often feels distant to modernize until details like this suddenly pull it close again. Because fear has never changed. Darkness has never changed. Waiting has never changed. Days continued slipping away, food supplies tightened, casualties increased, fatigue became visible everywhere. And yet, Constantinople still refused to die. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of the siege. The defenders were not surviving because of superior numbers, not because of superior technology, not because relief armies were coming. They survived because they refused to accept the mathematics of defeat. Again and again, Ottoman assaults struck weak points. Again and again, defenders pushed them back. Again and again, the city endured. But history can be merciless, because endurance and victory are not always the same thing. By late May, Mehmed understood something critical. The siege could not continue indefinitely. He would gamble everything on one overwhelming assault, one final attack, one final storm. And on the evening before that storm arrived, strange reports spread through Constantinople. Some described unusual lights above the city, others spoke of strange atmospheric events. People searched for signs and meanings. In desperate times, human beings always do. Some believed heaven itself was sending warnings. Others believed heaven had already turned away. Centuries later, facts become difficult to separate from fear and memory. But one truth remains certain. The atmosphere inside Constantinople had changed. People felt something approaching, and sometimes history carries a silence before impact. The city waited. The Ottoman camps waited. Thousands of men looked toward walls that had stood for 1,000 years. And somewhere in darkness, Emperor Constantine XI prepared for the final hours of the Roman Empire. The final night arrived beneath an uneasy sky. Across the Ottoman camps, thousands of fires burned in the darkness like scattered stars fallen onto the earth. The army knew what was coming. Orders moved through the ranks, weapons were inspected, armor was repaired one final time. Imams walked among soldiers, prayers rose into the night air. Beyond the walls, Constantinople waited. Inside, churches' candles flickered beneath ancient icons blackened by centuries of smoke. Men who had spent weeks carrying stones and fighting on the walls now stood beside priests in silence. Some prayed for victory, some prayed for mercy, some simply lowered their heads because no words remained. Emperor Constantine XI moved among his men. No throne, no ceremony, no distance between ruler and soldier. He knew there would likely be no tomorrow. Accounts written after the fall describe his final speech as a call to defend faith, family, and city. The exact words disappeared into history long ago. Different chroniclers remembered different phrases. But the meaning survived. Fight, stand, hold. And there is something profoundly tragic here. Constantine was not standing before an army expecting triumph. He was standing before men who understood reality perfectly. They knew relief was not coming. They knew the numbers. They knew the walls were failing. And they remained. Near midnight, the city bells rang. Then they stopped. Hours passed. The darkness felt endless. Then, shortly before dawn on May 29th, 1453, the Ottoman assault began. The first wave moved toward the walls. Thousands advanced through smoke and dust toward breaches opened by artillery. Arrows filled the air. Gunpowder weapons cracked through the darkness. Drums thundered across the battlefield. The sound must have been overwhelming. Not a battle, a collision. The defenders met the attack with arrows, crossbows, stones, spears, boiling materials, and desperate force. The first Ottoman wave struck and failed. Bodies covered sections of the ground before the walls. The defenders pushed them back. For a moment the line held. But Mehmed had expected losses. The first assault had never been intended to break Constantinople. It was intended to exhaust it. Soon the second wave advanced. Fresh troops entered the attack. Again, the walls disappeared beneath violence. Again, men fought in shattered openings where ancient stone had become piles of broken rock and earth. The fighting reached a level of closeness difficult even to imagine now. No space, no formations, no elegant movements from paintings and heroic artwork. Only chaos, mud, blood, smoke, men pushing against men with almost no room to breathe. The defenders held again, but now exhaustion had become visible. Hours of combat was stripping away strength. Casualties mounted. The walls remained in Byzantine hands, barely. Then, Mehmed committed his elite troops. The Janissaries advanced, disciplined, organized, relentless. Unlike earlier attackers, they did not rush forward in disorder. They moved with purpose. Drums echoed behind them. Standards moved through smoke. The final attack had begun. Pressure increased across the defensive lines. Then the battle reached one of those moments where history suddenly narrows into a single event. Giovanni Giustiniani was wounded. The exact details remain debated. Some accounts describe an arrow, others describe gunfire or fragments from battle, but the result was the same. He was severely injured. He left his position. At first glance, this sounds like a simple battlefield detail. It was not, because morale can stand upon fragile foundations. Giustiniani had become one of those foundations. As word spread, confusion followed. Confusion became uncertainty. Uncertainty became weakness. And weakness during a siege can move faster than fire. At nearly the same moment, another event unfolded near a small gate known as the Siege Porta. Historical arguments continue even now. Some historians question parts of the story. Others accept it. But according to many accounts, this gate may have been left unsecured during the chaos. Ottoman soldiers found a way through. Small numbers at first, then more. Banners appeared where banners should never have appeared. Inside the city, panic began spreading. And once panic enters a defense, events accelerate with terrifying speed. Lines started collapsing. Orders became difficult to hear. Men no longer understood where danger existed. Emperor Constantine XI saw what was happening. He understood the end had arrived. One detail survives through the centuries with extraordinary power. As the final moments approached, Constantine reportedly removed symbols of imperial rank: no crown, no imperial distinction, no separation from the soldiers around him. He refused escape. He refused surrender. Instead, he moved toward the fighting, toward the chaos, toward the collapsing lines. And then he disappeared. His final moments remain uncertain. No surviving account can tell us precisely where he fell. No witness recorded the exact instant. Perhaps there is something fitting in that. The last Roman emperor did not die on a throne. He vanished into battle, into smoke, into confusion, into history itself. By sunrise, Ottoman forces were pouring into Constantinople. After more than 1,000 years, the Roman Empire had ended. The city that had endured siege after siege, century after century, had finally fallen. The sounds inside Constantinople changed. Church bells gave way to shouting, weapons gave way to footsteps. The battle was over, but history was beginning something new. Sultan Mehmed entered the city later that day. He was 21 years old. 21. He had achieved what countless rulers before him could not. The prize that had stood beyond reach for generations now belonged to him. He rode through streets marked by destruction and silence. Then he reached Hagia Sophia. For nearly 1,000 years, it had stood as one of the greatest symbols of Christendom. Now history shifted again. Empires rise believing they will endure forever. Empires collapse believing they still have time. Constantinople teaches something uncomfortable. Strength fades, walls fall. Certainties disappear. Even civilizations that seem eternal eventually meet their final morning. And perhaps that is why the Siege of 1453 still feels strangely alive after all these centuries. Because this was never only the story of 7,000 against 100,000. It was the story of endurance against inevitability, of men standing on walls already cracked by history, of an empire making its final stand long after logic demanded surrender. And when the sun rose over Constantinople on May 29th, it illuminated more than a conquered city. It illuminated the end of one world and the beginning of another.